throne, no crown, no grand blessings before the crowds, and yet many believe his power far exceeds that of the official Pope of the Vatican. Inside the world's smallest sovereign city lies a hidden power structure, shielded by centuries of tradition, unbreakable oaths, and a chilling silence. Here, decisions that could alter the fate of nations, or even the course of human history, are not announced on television. They're whispered through ancient stone corridors. Have you ever wondered who really controls the Vatican? And why do people fear the title Superior General even more than Pope? This story has no hero standing in the spotlight, only shadows moving behind the curtain. For centuries, the world has watched the white throne of the Vatican, the seat of the Catholic Pope, seen by millions as the representative of God on earth. To the faithful, he is a beacon of spiritual light, the guardian of truth and righteousness. But few know that just steps away from that throne, inside a modest building with no crown, no white robes, lies a power many believe to be untouchable. That power belongs to the Superior General, the supreme commander of the Jesuit order, or Societas Jesu. For centuries, he has never appeared before the public like the Pope. He gives no blessings, leads no grand masses, delivers no Christmas addresses in St. Peter's Square. And yet, according to documents, rumors, and even faint traces in long-forgotten historical records, he may be the one truly pulling the strings of power within the Vatican. It's no coincidence that politicians, generals, and even cardinals refer to him by a name both reverent and chilling, the Black Pope. The name doesn't just come from the black robes of the Jesuits, but from the shadowy power he wields in absolute silence, a power with no spotlight, yet capable of shaping the spiritual light of millions. His presence, or more precisely, his mysterious absence, has long stirred a question no one dares to answer aloud. Who really holds power inside the Vatican? And how has this tiny nation, barely a square kilometre in size, managed to influence wars, governments, and the fate of continents for centuries? Something about the official story doesn't add up. There are missing pages, vanished documents, and decisions made with no trace of who signed them. And in the background of every unclear event, the Jesuits appear. Quiet, yet impossible to erase. So, is the Black Pope merely a religious figure? Or is he part of a hidden network of global power the world has never fully understood? Tonight, Bedtime History invites you to step beyond that heavy curtain, tracing the origins of the Jesuit order and uncovering the hidden layers of nearly 500 years of secrets they never taught you in school. If the Vatican is a spiritual kingdom, then the Jesuits are its elite special forces, not just because of their intellect or iron discipline, but because of their chilling, unconditional devotion. Societas Jesu, known as the Jesuit order, was founded in 1540 during the chaotic wave of the Protestant Reformation. As thinkers like Martin Luther challenged the authority of the Catholic Church, the Vatican realized it needed something more powerful than doctrine, an organization that would fight not with prayers, but with strategy, knowledge, and, if necessary, covert action. The Jesuits were founded by Ignatius of Loyola, a Spanish knight wounded in battle. During his long recovery, he didn't lay down his sword. He simply replaced it with Scripture. Though he left the battlefield behind, he never abandoned the warrior's spirit. And so he built a religious order shaped like a military unit, complete with ranks, commands, discipline, and absolute obedience. Jesuit priests are not the quiet, cloistered monks most imagine. They don't hide in monasteries. They go out into the world. They study languages, master science, advise kings, and build educational networks stretching from Europe to Asia. They are warriors on the battlefield of ideas, persuaders, missionaries, strategists. They enter foreign empires not with weapons, but with something even more powerful: intellect and total dedication. The Jesuits quickly became the strategic brain of the Catholic Church. They established hundreds of elite schools across the world, educating not just the faithful, but also the elite. Many of their students would go on to become politicians, generals, and sometimes enemies. Beneath their simple black robes were minds sharpened like blades. What inspired admiration also inspired fear: their oath. Not just a vow to God, but specifically to the Superior General, the only man with authority over the entire Jesuit order, even above the Pope. Once sworn in, a Jesuit is no longer a mere individual, but a part of a secret mechanism operating silently and with chilling precision. Whispers began to spread. The Jesuits weren't just preaching, they were spying, toppling regimes, and manipulating global politics. Maybe it's just exaggeration. But if so, why have more than 80 countries expelled them at some point in history? From France, Spain, and Portugal to China, entire governments saw them as a hidden threat. The Jesuits left no armies behind, but they left influence. They didn't conquer land. They won over hearts and minds. They didn't rule with force. They ruled through ideas. And sometimes ideas are more dangerous than swords. At the center of this system stands the Superior General, quietly expanding his network, training new soldiers, and commanding an empire with no map, no borders, yet present everywhere. That's when the name Black Pope began to surface, not in public speeches, but in private conversations between world leaders, in classified documents and in investigations that never quite reached their end. In most religious organizations, the leader is a symbol, not the one making strategic decisions. But within the Jesuit order, the Superior General is far more than just a symbol. He holds real power, designed as the central command of a global operating system. That's why he's called the Black Pope, not because he opposes the White Pope, but because he exists in a parallel realm of power, hidden, unmonitored, and almost untouchable. The title Superior General isn't a modern invention born from conspiracy theories. It's real, officially recognized within the structure of the Jesuits, and it has existed for nearly 500 years. What makes historians curious and world leaders uneasy is the near-absolute authority this role holds. Unlike cardinals or bishops, who answer to the Pope, the Superior General doesn't need Vatican approval to move personnel, expand influence, or launch what are called special pastoral missions. In internal Jesuit documents, his orders are regarded as the voice of God to his subordinates, a level of obedience so intense many compare him to a military general from the feudal era. The building where he works, known as the Curia, Generalizia, sits near the Vatican, yet operates independently from papal oversight. It functions as a global strategic headquarters, receiving reports from Jesuit branches around the world, analyzing geopolitical conditions, and coordinating educational, missionary, and, according to some classified records, political influence operations in key nations. Even more remarkable, the Superior General is not elected by the public and doesn't need the recognition of Catholics worldwide. He's chosen internally by a small circle of high-ranking Jesuit priests, individuals whose names and actions rarely appear in the press. It's no wonder, then, that people begin to ask, is this a democratic structure within religion, or a closed power system where decisions are always made by a hidden few? Some historians refer to the Superior General as the ghost advisor to the Pope, because many popes throughout history were either Jesuits themselves or deeply influenced by Jesuit institutions. While one man blesses the crowd from the balcony of St. Peter's, another sits in the Curia Generalizia, reviewing reports from Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and planning the next global move. It's a machine, precise, efficient, and invisible. The true extent of that power is hard to trace. There's no map, no official numbers, no public budget. But scattered clues throughout history suggest one thing. The Superior General doesn't just run the Jesuit order, he coordinates influence. From elite universities and charitable foundations to closed-door summits where world policies are shaped, the shadow of the Jesuits, and behind it, the Black Pope, is never far. And that's what makes people uneasy. The greatest power is not the one you can see, it's the one you never see, but still controls everything. Not long after their founding, the Jesuits began doing something few religious orders in history had ever dared to imagine. They infiltrated the very heart of secular power in Europe, not with weapons, but with influence, while other monastic orders retreated into quiet contemplation. The Jesuits marched into royal courts, academic halls, and secret chambers, the very places where decisions were made that would shape the lives of millions. They didn't need thrones, because they had mastered the art of influencing those who already sat on them. The 16th and 17th centuries were an age of religious wars and blood-soaked alliances between the Church and feudal dynasties. Amid that chaos, the Jesuits emerged as unofficial advisors, spiritual guides, royal confessors, always knowing what to say and when to say it. In France, Jesuit priests not only taught in royal academies, they also became spiritual mentors to members of the Bourbon family, one of the continent's most powerful dynasties. They knew how to turn prayers into instruments of governance and how to transform scripture into the language of diplomacy. In Spain and Portugal, where royal power was tightly bound to Catholic faith, Jesuits became the spiritual architects of overseas empires. While Spanish ships set sail in search of gold, Jesuit missionaries quietly spread the faith across the New World, sometimes leading the way, sometimes following the troops, but always the last to leave. In Austria, Poland, even Russia, Jesuits were more than missionaries. They trained the next generation of rulers, princes, dukes, and even pagan nobility in philosophy, politics, and theology. They shaped minds before they took the throne, planting Jesuit thought where it mattered most, at the roots of power. And when they couldn't speak directly to kings, they found another path. They became royal advisors, confessors, or private tutors to heirs. They didn't need to be kings, they just needed to sit beside those who would become one. That alone was enough to raise concern in royal circles. Whispers began to spread. When a king speaks, you may be hearing a Jesuit's voice echoing from behind the curtain. With a vast network of schools, churches, and training centers, the Jesuits didn't just create an elite education system. They cultivated an entire generation of thinkers loyal to their worldview. Children raised under Jesuit guidance grew up to be bishops, generals, ministers, men who entered the world of power already seeded with ideas planted long ago. This rise was no accident. It was deliberate, step by step, because the Jesuits understood if you want to change the world, start with the source of ideas, and ideas, planted at the right moment, travel farther than any law or army. Over time, this quiet presence became a thorn in the side of many governments. Some kings banned them, some courts expelled them, but they always came back because the seeds they planted in the minds of youth had already taken root And so, when the question arose, who really controls the game of Europe? The answer wasn't always found on the throne, but in this library, where a Jesuit sat silently, book in hand, saying nothing, while his ideas echoed in secret councils of kings. In history, few religious organizations have ever been expelled from more than 80 countries and territories, and yet survived, even returned stronger as if untouched. The Jesuits are the exception, and that exception has led many historians to ask, were they merely a missionary order or a hidden network of influence that empires were forced to confront? The 18th century marked the height of suspicion. Across Europe, royal courts began sensing something beyond their control, seeping into politics, education, even the military. There were no uprisings, no battles, only presence, steady, disciplined, and nearly impossible to remove. In 1759, King Joseph I of Portugal, under the guidance of the powerful Prime Minister Sebastião de Pombal, ordered the expulsion of all Jesuit priests, not because they preached heresy, not because of religious conflict, but because they had grown too skilled at shaping education, and through it the minds of the young nobility. Those educated by the Jesuits no longer blindly followed the crown. They questioned power. They thought independently, and at times they placed faith above the king's law. In 1764, it was France's turn. Under King Louis XV, the Jesuits were accused of operating beyond religious bounds and were slowly pushed out of every position in the state. Their schools were shut down, their assets seized. Strangely, no clear crime was ever stated. The reasons were vague, as if the monarchy feared something it couldn't name, but knew was very real. Spain, Naples, Parma, and finally, even the Vatican followed. In 1773, under immense pressure from European powers, Pope Clement XIV issued the decree Dissolution of the Society of Jesus, officially disbanding the Jesuits worldwide. It was supposed to be the end, but the strange part began there. There were no rebellions, no violence, no retaliation. The Jesuits simply disappeared, as if they had seen it coming. In many countries, they didn't resist. They simply changed robes, moved underground, continued teaching, writing, and training. New generations under different names. Their libraries, filled with strategic knowledge, were not burned. Some were hidden by noble families who knew. The Jesuits could be banned, but the ideas they planted would outlast any royal decree. And then, less than 40 years later, in 1814, the Jesuits were fully restored by Pope Pius VII. Not because their past had been forgiven, but because the Vatican realized something crucial. In an age of rising secularism and anti-clerical movements, no one could defend the faith more effectively than the Jesuits. The real question is, how could an organization condemned across Europe survive and return stronger? Was some hidden force protecting them? Or had they built a system so deeply rooted in the intellectual class, the ruling elite, and international networks, that it became immune to surface-level politics? Their mass expulsion didn't weaken them. It made them harder to trace. No longer tied to fixed monasteries, they became mobile, adaptable, and ready for any political shift. An empire with no borders, just loyalty and intellect. And at the head of that empire, the Black Pope continued issuing commands, in silence, unbound by Vatican law, unaffected by national borders. He remains the only leader in Catholic history to command a global network, one that was banned but never broken. There's something strange about history. The most mysterious forces rarely clash in public. They move in silence, like two underground rivers flowing beneath a city that's never been mapped. The Jesuits and Freemasonry are two such currents, one cloaked in religious devotion, the other in ancient esoteric knowledge. Both have shaped secular power in profound ways, and yet it's never quite clear whether they are enemies or reflections of the same force. On the surface, the Vatican has long condemned Freemasonry, labeling it heretical, atheistic, and morally relativistic. Several papal decrees have banned Catholics from joining, calling it a betrayal of the faith. Meanwhile, Freemasonry, grounded in reason, science, and humanism, has often criticized the Church as outdated, oppressive, and hostile to free thought. But a deeper paradox lingers. Both groups operate in secrecy. Both are highly structured, both span the globe, and both are often found circling centers of political, financial, and military power. This overlap raises unsettling questions. Are they rivals, or simply two branches of the same invisible hand? Some historians, and more than a few old conspiracies, suggest a murky relationship between the Jesuits and the Freemasons, especially during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, when monarchies began to crumble, revolutions flared across continents, and the map of global power was being redrawn. There are whispers that exiled Jesuits, cast out during their suppression, quietly joined Masonic lodges, bringing with them insider knowledge and organizational precision, just what Freemasonry needed to expand its reach across Europe and the New World. Both groups share eerily similar traits: secret rituals, hierarchical structures, coded language, and above all, an oath of unwavering loyalty to the Brotherhood. These parallels are too precise to dismiss as coincidence. One scholar once wrote, "If the Jesuits were born in the light of faith, Freemasonry was born in the light of reason, but both understood that real power never shines in public." One of the most intriguing hotspots was post-revolutionary France. As churches were destroyed and clergy fled or capitulated, the Jesuits reappeared quietly within intellectual circles, many of which were heavily influenced by Masonic ideology. There is indirect evidence suggesting that Jesuit priests acted as advisors inside certain secret societies tied to Freemasonry, especially in educational and social reform projects. While never publicly acknowledged, the overlap in people and philosophy in these grey zones has long puzzled historians. No official document confirms any alliance. The Vatican denies it. Freemasonry stays silent. But in historical research, silence from both sides is often louder than any accusation. It's also important to remember that Freemasonry is not a single, unified entity. It's a web of local lodges with varying degrees of religious and political influence. In England and America, it often leaned toward humanism and Enlightenment values. In continental Europe, especially in France and Italy, it delved deep into politics, even acting against the Church's influence. And yet, in those same places, the Jesuits never vanished, sometimes as guardians of faith, other times as silent observers in the background. Then comes the boldest theory of all, that neither the Jesuits nor the Freemasons are enemies, or even true allies, but rather two arms of a higher control system, one that uses both faith and reason not in conflict, but in tandem, to shape the world, a system in which the Black Pope isn't the supreme commander, but merely a link in a far greater chain. One that history has never quite had the words or courage to name. When speaking of Europe's religious history, few words send a deeper chill than heresy. And behind that fear stood a powerful machine, the Inquisition, where faith was no longer a source of salvation, but a blade held above those who dared to think differently. Yet behind these brutal trials, few noticed a figure who never stood before the public, but quietly shaped the direction of it all, the superior general of the Jesuits, the Black Pope. The Inquisition had existed since the 12th century, but by the 16th century, it entered a new era of ruthless precision, coinciding with the dramatic rise of the Jesuit order. The Vatican didn't just need faith to fight off the Protestant Reformation. It needed something sharper, a tool to control thought and extinguish rebellion before it could even form. And the Jesuits were the perfect force. They had the intellect to detect dangerous ideas, the educational reach to reshape beliefs, and, most importantly, a surveillance network that spanned the Catholic world. They didn't need soldiers or spilled blood. They simply sent reports, discreetly, to their headquarters, where the superior general read and issued orders. Not every Jesuit took part in interrogations or trials. That wasn't their role. Their power lay in something deeper, direction. They were the ones who wrote the manuals that defined the line between orthodoxy and heresy. They designed the intellectual filters in schools where even a student's question could be seen as evidence of spiritual rebellion. And they, or more precisely, their superior general, controlled the flow of thought at its source. No need for prisons. He controlled minds through internal memos, subtle, coded directives distributed across Europe like a remote censorship system. It worked so well, even those never accused of heresy feared thinking differently. Some historians have written, "Your thoughts weren't killed by torture. They were killed by deliberate silence." The Jesuits understood this perfectly. They didn't need to interrogate. They created an environment where people policed themselves. In that climate, deviant ideas didn't need to be punished. They disappeared, not because they didn't exist, but because no one dared to speak them. Some records suggest many Inquisition cases were sparked by Jesuit reports, submitted after lectures or private theological discussions, where something said behind closed doors was later encoded and sent back to headquarters, where the superior general would decide whether a larger investigation was warranted. This wasn't preaching anymore. It was mental manipulation through intellect. It wasn't about defending faith, but redefining it through invisible control. The Inquisition was the public tool, but the long-term strategies, the mental frameworks, and the silent detection of spiritual dissent all bore the fingerprint of Jesuit thinking. And when such a system runs smoothly, or like a machine with no sound, the one orchestrating it from the shadows becomes far more dangerous than any judge in the courtroom. The superior general never needed to step inside a tribunal. A single nod from him, and an entire network of fiercely loyal priests would ensure that any dangerous thought disappeared before it ever had the chance to grow. The Vatican, barely 44 hectares in size, smaller than a standard golf course, is still the place where world leaders pay silent visits, intelligence agencies tread carefully, and billions of believers look toward with reverence or unease. In a world run by oil, finance, and military force, the Vatican exists as a paradox. It has no vast army, no independent central bank, no natural resources, and yet it exerts global political influence in ways very few truly understand. Behind those ancient stone walls, Roman, thick, and silent, the official pope isn't always the one pulling every string. Researchers, politicians, and former members of secret orders have all hinted at this. There is a strategic brain behind the Vatican, a center of command that operates with colder logic than faith. And more often than not, that figure is the superior general of the Jesuits, the so-called Black Pope. Unlike the Pope, who must appear before the crowds, address the press, deliver public speeches. The Black Pope stays hidden. He coordinates a vast and cross-border network of universities, research centers, charities, and international advisory boards, all under the banner of education, but quietly gathering intelligence, shaping influence, and building ties with the world's political elite. The Jesuits operate in over 110 countries. They don't need embassies, because every chapel, every school, every Jesuit university is a cultural outpost, a place where they teach and quietly connect with the local power structure. From South American presidents to Asian prime ministers, many leaders were once educated under Jesuit systems, and whether by design or by chance, they often carry with them the philosophy, the discipline, and the loyalty to the order that formed them. In modern politics, ideological loyalty may be more enduring than military alliances. A single policy, a worldview, a quiet belief, if planted in childhood, can last far longer than any treaty. The Jesuits know this well. They don't just teach people to read, they train the people who will write the rules. The Vatican has no satellites. Information flows to it constantly. The Jesuits have no public intelligence agency, but in every classroom, every charity, every chapel, there are those who know when to listen, when to observe, and, more importantly, whom to report to. They don't need to break laws, they just need to be in the right room, with the right person. And so in those quiet, closed-door meetings, where global strategies are shaped without fanfare, the name of the superior general may never be spoken, but his influence is there, in the reports, in the data, and in the caution with which others speak. One researcher once remarked, "The Vatican is the only country that doesn't need to declare its power, because every other center of power already knows what it holds." And in that silent machinery, the Black Pope never needs to step forward. He only ensures that every link functions, from a schoolboy in Manila to a researcher in Boston to a priest in Buenos Aires. When needed, he doesn't issue commands. He shifts the direction of thought. In a world where missiles mean less than information and ideology outweighs force, the Vatican, with its quiet, intricate system built by the Jesuits, has become a true superpower of influence. It doesn't need borders, yet it shapes nations from within. And that is why, in the back rooms of global summits, you'll often hear a whisper. Who's sitting with the Vatican and who's listening? From behind the curtain, in black. The history of the Vatican is cloaked in sacred light, but also shadowed by a quiet darkness, where death does not always come from illness, and the sudden passing of a pope can plunge the world into silence. On September 28, 1978, just 33 days after taking the papal throne, Pope John Paul II was found dead, quietly, in his private chamber inside the Vatican. No sound, no warning, no prior signs of serious illness. He left this world with a silence so deep it became suspicious. That silence sparked a storm of questions that still echo decades later. John Paul II was no ordinary figure. He was known for his reformist vision, his closeness to the faithful, and his clear intention to purge the Vatican of its growing political and financial entanglements. But that very resolve, according to many theories, made him a threat to those with deep, entrenched power. Among them, some speculate, was a radical conservative faction within the Jesuit order. Just days before his death, John Paul I was reportedly preparing a complete restructuring of the Vatican's financial apparatus, especially targeting the Vatican Bank, long rumored to be involved in money laundering, fraud, and ties to the Italian mafia. He also planned to remove several high-ranking cardinals, some of whom were allegedly connected to secret societies like P2, Propaganda Due, a clandestine Masonic lodge that had infiltrated banking, politics, and even the church itself. The problem? Many key figures in these networks had either direct or indirect ties to the Jesuits. No one named the Superior General directly, but independent investigations, from journalists, historians, even former intelligence agents, all pointed in the same direction. There is a hand inside the Vatican, unseen on camera, but coordinating everything. On the night before his death, John Paul I is said to have called in a few trusted aides to discuss a list of transfers and removals he intended to announce. That list has never been made public. By morning, he was found lifeless, a book resting open on his chest, his glasses still on his face. The cause of death was officially listed as a heart attack. There was no autopsy, no independent investigation, no detailed medical report. It was all closed as God's will. But for those familiar with the Vatican's inner workings, that silence rang louder than any funeral bell. Years later, books like In God's Name by David Yallop and The Vatican Connection by Richard Hammer tried to lift the veil. Though unable to offer definitive legal proof, they agreed on one thing: powerful forces in the shadows, off any official list, had decided John Paul I could not continue. And among the suspects, the Jesuits, with their global network, iron discipline, and subtle ability to influence internal church dynamics, were consistently mentioned, no direct accusations. But no one ruled them out, so the question remains: could someone possess enough power to bring down a pope? And if so, would he need to act alone, or simply press a button and let the silent machine do the rest? In the shadows of the Vatican, truth never stands in the light, it's only glimpsed in missing files, vanishing traces, and questions no one dares ask aloud. In any organization, an oath is the foundation. It is the thread that binds a person to the mission, to the cause, to something higher than life itself. But in the Jesuit order, the oath is not just a ritual, it is a total contract, a transformation of the individual into an instrument of absolute obedience. The Jesuits are known to have one of the most rigorous training processes in the Catholic world. Becoming a Jesuit is not simply about studying theology or practicing religious rites. It is a years-long journey, a series of tests, both physical, intellectual, and spiritual. But at the very end of that journey comes one ceremony, the final oath. And that oath is what makes the Jesuits unlike any other order. In that sacred vow, a Jesuit swears absolute loyalty, not just to the Pope, but to the Superior General of the Jesuits. Not loyalty in the symbolic sense, but in its literal, uncompromising form. Commands are treated as the voice of God. Personal opinions, emotions, even doubt, must be erased to reach the mental state of being fully ready for any mission, anywhere, at any time. There is a passage, long debated, but often cited by scholars from the Jesuits' higher-level oath: I commit that I will have no will but that of the order, that I will go wherever commanded, do whatever is required, even if it means entering cursed lands, infiltrating the enemy, or destroying the Church's enemies by any means necessary. While the Vatican has never officially confirmed this dramatic text, internal training documents offer indirect clues, manuals that outline how to erase personal will, how to see the world not through your own eyes, but through the lens of the order. One core principle is repeated over and over: perinde assi cadaver, as a corpse, meaning, obey your superiors as a lifeless body, motionless before another's will. No resistance, no questioning. no interpretation. It is this mindset that allows the Jesuits to function globally across cultures, languages, and governments. A Jesuit in Congo may act in perfect harmony with a Jesuit in Canada because both have been programmed with the same thought system, bound to one master, the Black Pope. And it's not just theory. In real life, these vows have translated into action, entering war zones, going undercover in hostile groups, or executing silent missions that have never appeared in any official news bulletin. Some say the Jesuits don't need prisons to hold people. They hold them with oaths. Oaths not just enforced by doctrine, but through an internal surveillance system where each member is taught to monitor himself and report himself if he strays from the path. In such a structure, the superior general doesn't need punishment. He only needs a glance, a quiet message to prompt thousands around the world to adjust themselves like gears rotating in perfect synchrony. This discipline doesn't just create organizational strength. It creates a form of irreversible power. Each individual becomes a loyal signal tower, feeding a global network serving one purpose and one commander. And throughout history, any organization that commands such loyalty, regardless of what it's called, is not merely a religion. It is a system, a strategy, a tool in a much larger game than any sermon could ever describe. When the sails of Spain and Portugal cut across the oceans in the 16th century, the world entered a new era, the age of colonial empires. But in every expedition, among the soldiers, merchants, and explorers, there was always at least one figure in a black robe holding a crucifix, carrying sacred hymns instead of weapons. He was a Jesuit priest, tasked with a mission no less important than gold, the conquest of souls. The Jesuits didn't arrive in the New World to seize land through force. They came to gain spiritual control through faith. In untouched territories, among forest-dwelling tribes or remote highland communities, they built missions, churches, schools, and slowly reorganized indigenous life according to Catholic doctrine. In Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina, they established self-contained communities called reducciones, where native people lived separately from colonial society under the total authority of Jesuit priests. On paper, these were peaceful sanctuaries, without private property, without violence, filled with music, prayer, and education. A Catholic paradise, deep in the jungle, but the question remains: paradise for whom? While empires looted gold and enslaved bodies, the Jesuits claimed they came to protect the dignity and souls of the indigenous. But they too managed vast resources, land, agriculture, livestock, and even controlled trade in salt and exotic timber. Some historians describe the reducciones as functioning like mini-theocracies, self-sufficient, tightly governed, and structured almost like an empire within an empire. Not all indigenous people converted willingly. Many were pressured through a form of soft assimilation. Those who didn't convert couldn't be saved, couldn't access education, and were excluded from God-protected communities. It was a subtle mental chain more powerful than any rope. People weren't bound by force, but by beliefs carefully reshaped at their roots. To the Vatican, the Jesuits' success in the New World was a great triumph. They had not only spread faith, but built a model society, proof that religion could lay the foundation for an entire civilization. But to the colonial powers, this model slowly became a threat. The native communities under Jesuit protection grew wealthier and more independent. And worst of all, they pledged loyalty to the Jesuits, not to the king. In 1767, King Carlos III of Spain, alarmed by the growing influence of the Jesuits in South America, ordered their expulsion from all Spanish colonies. Hundreds of missions were abandoned. The indigenous people, who had lived for generations under the Jesuits' fatherly rule, were now forcibly absorbed into imperial systems by military force. An entire order collapsed. But the seeds had already been planted. Before their departure, the Jesuits copied everything: documents, maps, records, internal reports, and smuggled them back to Europe. At the time, the Superior General in Rome is believed to have issued silent orders to archive the entire knowledge base of the New World missions, and some of those documents have never been released. This reveals something deeper. The Jesuits were not only messengers of faith, they were keepers of secrets about an entire continent, secrets of indigenous cultures, of hidden riches, of geography, and perhaps most importantly, of how to control the human mind. And those secrets, stored quietly for centuries, may still be shaping strategies today. Strategies the world has never been told. While Europe was still intoxicated by the gold and silver fever of the Americas, the Jesuits had already set their sights farther, toward a land that held no gold in its soil, but something they desired even more: an ancient civilization, closed, proud, and immune to faith alone. That land was Asia. Unlike newly discovered territories, China and Japan were no strangers to power. They had emperors, dynasties, writing systems, and complex philosophies of their own. They could not be swayed by the Bible because they already had their own sacred texts. And so the Jesuits chose a different strategy. They wouldn't enter with crosses, but with telescopes, calendars, and knowledge. The first Jesuit to reach China was Matteo Ricci in the late 16th century. He didn't preach in markets wearing a priest's robe. He learned Mandarin, dressed like a Confucian scholar, and introduced Western science, astronomy, mathematics, cartography. He didn't ask the Chinese to believe in God, he asked them to respect the logic of the heavens. And once he earned their admiration, he introduced faith through philosophy. This approach, known as cultural adaptation, became the foundation of the Jesuits' campaign across Asia. They didn't confront native culture. They infiltrated it quietly, targeting scholars, ministers, and even members of the royal courts. In China, Jesuits played a major role in helping the Ming court reform its astronomical calendar, predict solar eclipses, and align imperial rituals with celestial movements. In a society where the sky symbolized divine mandate, this work gave them real power. For a time, Jesuit priests became unofficial advisors, trusted to oversee imperial observatories. In Japan, the path was harsher. Early Jesuits like Francis Xavier found success converting tens of thousands, especially in Kyushu. But once the ruling lords realized that the new faith could divide loyalties and carried European influence, the Tokugawa regime responded with brutal suppression. Christianity was banned. Persecution began. But the Jesuits didn't disappear. They went underground. Some lived in hiding for decades, training believers in silence, even dying as martyrs, without ever revealing the names of fellow priests. Their unwavering devotion earned them a title among Japanese believers: invisible warriors of faith. Despite the crackdown, Jesuit thought left a mark. Concepts of God, salvation, and Western moral philosophy began to seep into the Japanese intellectual class, planting seeds that would shape cultural reform centuries later. In China, the Jesuits also left behind a deep legacy in cartography, medicine, mathematics, and astronomy. But more than science, they left an ideological footprint, a quiet presence in cultural decisions. Even under the Qing, when Christianity was suppressed, Jesuit writings were still copied, studied, and circulated in elite scholarly circles in secret. More importantly, the Superior General of the Jesuits, from his office in Europe, always knew what was happening in the East. Detailed reports, maps, political charts, social analyses, all encoded and sent back to Rome. In many cases, he understood Asian courts better than most Western kings. No war, no conquest, no occupation. Yet the Jesuits succeeded in inserting themselves into the mental architecture of two of the world's oldest civilizations. And that tells us something. Their mission wasn't just to convert. It was to shape how a civilization thinks about itself. If the history of religion were a grand stage, then some of its fiercest battles never happened in the open. They didn't unfold on bloody fields, nor did they echo through church bells. They took place in the stone corridors of the Vatican, where prayers gave way to memos, to discreet counsel, and to decisions made in silence that could shift the fate of the Church itself. Since its founding in 1540, the Jesuit order, the Society of Jesus, has always stood apart. They were not monks chasing solitude or pure asceticism. They were trained to be strategists, educators, missionaries, and at times political advisors. That flexibility, that global reach, soon made them targets of suspicion, not from outsiders, but from within the Church itself. Among the clergy, a powerful bloc of traditionalists, those who held tightly to hierarchy and doctrinal stability, began viewing the Jesuits as too adaptable, too clever, too difficult to control. The tension first surfaced in their missionary approach. While other orders clung rigidly to ritual and dogma, the Jesuits embraced local culture. They dressed as Confucian scholars in China, used native terms to explain Christian theology, and merged local traditions into Catholic rites. To conservatives, this wasn't adaptation, it was betrayal. They accused the Jesuits of enabling heresy, watering down divine truth, and using faith as a tool for influence. But the real conflict was never just about theology. It was about power. As the Jesuits expanded across the world, educating elites, influencing politics, and shaping the minds of future leaders, a fear began to grow inside the Vatican that the Superior General was quietly building a parallel Vatican. Not one declared publicly why, but one very real. Some popes were openly uncomfortable. Pope Clement XV, who issued the decree to suppress the Jesuits in 1773, was said to be under pressure from conservative factions in the Curia, men who couldn't accept a religious order wielding more autonomy than most archbishops. At one point, whispers even suggested that the Jesuits could sway papal elections through carefully cultivated relationships in the College of Cardinals, or by mentoring key figures long before they rose to power. No proof was ever brought forward, but the questions never went away. The Jesuits, for their part, didn't confront these accusations head-on. They kept working, they kept training, they kept planting seeds. Their belief was simple, that opposition would fade, but ideas would endure longer than any accusation. Still, the friction never disappeared. Behind closed doors, intense debates unfolded between the traditionalist bloc and the Jesuit camp. They clashed over sensitive issues, liturgical reform, the role of lay people, and how deeply the Church should engage in modern politics. No side ever truly won. But in battles like these, the side that's more patient, more strategic, and more networked usually holds the real power. For decades, the Superior General of the Jesuits played the long game. He didn't appear at major ceremonies, but his influence could be found in Catholic universities, think tanks, policy institutes, and in nearly every place the Vatican couldn't afford to lose ground. Inside the Church, the Jesuits have never been fully welcomed, but they've never been cast out either, because the truth is they are what the Vatican cannot publicly embrace and yet cannot live without. When World War I and II erupted, the world spiraled into fire and steel, bombs, hatred, and the collapse of empires. Superpowers clashed, governments fell, tens of millions perished. But amid the gunfire and chaos, there was one force that held no army, fought no battle, and never appeared on any military map, yet managed to retain influence, information, and a foothold in both sides of every conflict. That force was the Jesuits. No official document ever stated that the Society of Jesus directly participated in war operations, and yet their presence across Europe, the Americas, and Asia, within both Allied and Axis territories, led many to believe that they quietly acted as channels of communication and brokers of subtle influence, especially during moments of transition. Before and during World War I, Jesuit priests operated schools, philosophy institutes, and missions across Germany, France, Austria, Hungary, Italy, and even Russia. They held no rifles, but they taught the children of generals, politicians, and aristocrats. Many high-ranking officers on all sides had once sat in Jesuit classrooms. The Vatican's official neutrality allowed Jesuits to move freely, send messages, and maintain quiet lines of contact at a time when ordinary communication was censored, intercepted, or destroyed. Post-war records suggest that Jesuits may have served as informal envoys carrying messages between rivals and even advising certain heads of state, always from the shadows. But it was World War II that placed the Jesuits in the most ambiguous spotlight. While the Vatican maintained a famously cautious silence in the face of Nazi Germany's rise, many Jesuit priests in Germany developed a complicated relationship with Hitler's regime. Some resisted. Some helped Jews escape, but others were reportedly used to spread anti-communist messages under the justification of protecting Christian Europe from the Bolshevik tide in the East. In Austria and Poland, many Jesuit clergy were imprisoned, tortured, or killed, yet some others were left untouched, still managing religious facilities or teaching under Nazi supervision. That inconsistency raised questions. Was there a dual strategy being quietly coordinated from within the Vatican? After the war, as the Cold War began to crystallize, the Jesuits emerged again, not weakened, but repositioned. Reports suggest that Jesuit networks were tapped by Allied powers, especially in Latin America, Eastern Europe, and Asia, where the threat of communism loomed. The post-war superior general never appeared in public, but was believed to have regular contact with the CIA, Vatican intelligence, and Catholic-aligned political movements in Europe. The contents of those exchanges remain secret, but the results speak for themselves. The Jesuits not only survived the war intact, they expanded their global reach. Empires collapsed, borders were redrawn, a new world order emerged, but the Jesuits remained unscathed, unprosecuted, unexposed. And that leaves us with a quiet question. Were they one of the few groups who saw the entire chessboard and simply placed their pieces wisely on both sides? In the blood-stained shadow of the 20th century, those who survived without weapons were not lucky. They were the ones who understood power best. And in the long history of the Catholic Church, no one has understood power better than the Society of Jesus. The world wars ended in flames, rubble, and moral wounds that had no precedent. Empires crumbled, millions were displaced. Faith in the old order shattered. As nations scrambled to rebuild their infrastructure and reassert political authority, there was one organization that did not need to recover because it had never truly fallen. It had simply stepped back to observe. And when the world began ushering in a new era, the Jesuits returned quietly, like a phoenix rising from the ashes. The post-war 20th century was an age of Cold War, consumerism, and globalization. But it was also a time when power no longer came from land or guns, but from controlling knowledge, ideas, and education systems. And in that domain, the Jesuits were masters. In less than 3 decades, the Society of Jesus restructured its global network. They reopened and modernized schools, universities, and research centers across the Americas, Europe, Asia, and Africa. They no longer focused solely on theology. Their curriculum now included social sciences, political thought, modern philosophy, even technology. Catholic values were no longer preached through Scripture alone. They were quietly embedded in humanism, critical thinking, sustainability, and global ethics. Gone were the lone missionaries in distant jungles. In their place stood humble professors at international conferences, policy advisors in development agencies, and strategists with Jesuit-educated minds in government offices and academic think tanks. They didn't wear priestly robes, but they thought like Jesuits, loyal to a philosophy that transcended borders and parties. It was during this period that the role of the superior general evolved. No longer just a spiritual leader, he became the global strategist of the order's influence. Reports flowed in from hundreds of Jesuit centers worldwide, analyzed, synthesized, and used to forecast political, social, and cultural trends. No need for espionage, no need for arms. Information was power, and the Jesuits understood this better than anyone. In the 1960s and 70s, as the world reeled from crises of belief, the Vietnam War, social revolutions, the spread of Marxist ideologies, the Jesuits did not resist. They entered the chaos. Many social activists, radical thinkers, even revolutionaries had once sat in Jesuit classrooms. And this wasn't a contradiction, it was a strategy. Because the Jesuits knew to shape the new world, you couldn't stand outside of disorder. You had to step into it and guide it from within. It was during these decades that people began to say the Jesuits are no longer missionaries. They're a global strategic institution. And perhaps that wasn't wrong. From United Nations meeting rooms to NGO headquarters, from Ivy League universities to post-colonial governments, Jesuit alumni were everywhere. They weren't wearing cassocks, but they carried with them a structured way of thinking shaped in classrooms long ago. Serve, adapt, but never abandon the mission. And then came a moment of quiet symbolism. In 2013, for the first time in Catholic history, the Church elected a Jesuit pope. Pope Francis, a former Jesuit priest, a man shaped by poverty and injustice in the barrios of South America. To the world, his rise was a sign of renewal. But for those who had studied the Jesuits for 5 centuries, it was the final crescendo of a long, patient plan. The student, now seated upon the white throne. And in the shadows, the Black Pope still remained. He did not seek applause. He did not appear before St. Peter's Square. But across continents, he quietly continued to coordinate a vast network, where seemingly unconnected individuals still moved toward a shared vision, faith, strategy, and unwavering service. As the world stepped into the post-World War II era, the map of global power was redrawn, not only through diplomatic summits, but through the shadows of intelligence networks. In the thick fog of the Cold War, where every superpower had its own ideology, its own tools, and its own objectives, there emerged unlikely allies, unspoken partnerships that no one would publicly admit, yet were unmistakably present in every strategic decision behind the scenes. Among the many controversial names of the 20th century, the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States, and the Jesuits, a Catholic religious order. Sworn to faith and justice are two names few would expect to find side by side. One operated with absolute secrecy, toppling governments, coordinating covert wars, and collecting global intelligence. The other, a religious order, educators, priests, and missionaries claiming to serve God and truth. And yet, that very contrast created a strange kind of synergy, one not easily explained by logic alone, because both organizations shared a unique trait: a global network, deep access to local communities, and the ability to penetrate society at its most fundamental level. After World War II, as America realized that nuclear weapons could never win hearts and minds, the CIA began seeking subtler channels of influence. And in this quiet battlefield, the Jesuits, with their hundreds of schools, universities, churches, and NGOs spread across the world, became an ideal partner. No official documents link the two, but countless testimonies, declassified files, and the recollections of former agents and clergy suggest that this informal alignment began in the 1950s, especially in hotspots like Latin America, Southeast Asia, and parts of Africa. In South America, where Marxist revolutions were erupting across the continent, many Jesuit priests led community education programs, but were also reported to provide intelligence on political shifts, public sentiment, and revolutionary activities. According to several reports, the CIA secretly collaborated with Jesuit clergy to collect social data, analyze political trends, and even coordinate anti-communist messaging through schools and churches. In Vietnam, during the war against the French and later against the Americans, Jesuit missions quietly became hubs of information exchange. With deep roots in local communities, priests and Catholic laypeople were able to gather critical intelligence from areas inaccessible to any foreign operative. They were trusted because they were men of faith. And that trust gave them access even intelligence agencies could not achieve. In Africa, where the Cold War turned into a race for influence between the US and the Soviet Union, the Jesuits launched modern missions focused on health, education, and humanitarian work. Yet some former American operatives later admitted Jesuit centers often provided more reliable, more neutral reports than US embassies themselves. And there's another intriguing detail. Many senior CIA officials were educated in Jesuit-run institutions, most notably Georgetown University, one of the most influential Jesuit universities in the US. Both institutions claimed to serve community, oppose tyranny, and defend freedom. But the interpretation of that freedom, it varied and ran deep. So were the CIA and the Jesuits truly allies, or just two powerful forces moving in the same direction for different reasons? There's no simple answer. But from a strategic perspective, they shared one profound goal: control of the mind. One wielded espionage, technology, and data. The other used sermons, education, and belief. But the ultimate objective remained the same: to shape the world according to a vision they each believed was right. And in a world where battles are no longer fought with bombs, but with information, perception, and thought, those who influence how we think, feel, and act are the ones who truly hold power. If the CIA is the master of information, then the global financial elite are the masters of money. And in today's world, there is no power more enduring than the one that controls both minds and money. That's why a question, once dismissed as conspiracy theory, is now being taken more seriously. Could the Jesuits, with their global network and centuries of influence, be aligned with, or even guiding, some of the world's wealthiest families and corporations? The Jesuits have long been known for their intellect and strategic thinking. As early as the 16th century, they understood one essential truth: a religious order cannot survive on faith alone. It must be financially strong, independent, and resilient. That's why they were one of the first religious groups to invest heavily in land, education, and especially banking. From mission centers in Latin America to universities in Europe and North America, the Jesuits quietly built a vast and intricate web of assets, often protected under non-profit status, yet deeply connected to major corporations, central banks, and private investment funds. Independent researchers have pointed out that many founders or senior advisors at powerful European banks were either former Jesuit priests or were directly trained at Jesuit academies. Names like Rothschild, Morgan, even certain discreet Swiss banking institutions have had consultants and thought leaders with backgrounds rooted in Jesuit education. In the US, schools like Georgetown, Fordham, and Boston College are more than just religious universities. They're breeding grounds for political figures, financial lawyers, and global economic advisors. Many prominent alumni have gone on to become hedge fund executives, central bank officials, or even finance ministers. But the real alliance lies not just in education, it lies in shared philosophy. Jesuits don't simply teach people how to succeed, they teach them to serve a greater cause, one that values order, stability, and a moral influence on society. For global elites who constantly seek a humanitarian face to protect their wealth and avoid public backlash, Jesuit ideology offers the perfect, silent partnership. That's why in many countries, large-scale development projects funded by major banks are often overseen or advised by Jesuit-run institutions or charitable arms. This cooperation creates a new kind of soft power, where finance and faith operate under the banner of goodwill. There are global charities building schools, feeding the poor, and delivering aid, but behind them are banking entities accused of market manipulation, money laundering, or destabilizing developing economies. So who connects these two worlds? Often the answer is former Jesuit priests or individuals deeply shaped by Jesuit systems of ideological training. The Superior General, often called the Black Pope, has never appeared in front of a global financial summit. Yet through think tanks, advisory boards, and the Jesuits' tightly woven international network, he likely knows where the money is flowing, who is pulling the strings, and where to place influence for maximum social effect. This is no longer just religion. It is a coordinated global structure of power where each financial decision can set off a chain reaction in education, politics, and even spiritual life. And in that game, the Jesuits may not be the ones moving the pieces in plain sight, but they are the ones shaping the board. The elite may control the markets, the intelligence agencies may control the flow of information, but to steer the course of an entire civilization, you need more than money or data. You need a place where the world's true decision-makers can gather in silence, away from cameras, untouched by democracy, and immune to public opinion. They call them secret conferences. It's not uncommon in modern history. Major events, from financial crashes to presidential elections, regime collapses, or sudden shifts in national foreign policy, have followed private meetings with no official records, no public statements. And yet, someone always knows. And certain shadowy figures are seen again and again. The Jesuits often among those. Whispered in suspicion, they leave no public trace. But the quiet presence of Jesuit members, or those trained in their institutions, at Bilderberg meetings, at the World Economic Forum in Davos, or inside Vatican advisory boards, has been noted. They don't wear collars, they don't claim to represent religion, but they carry a way of thinking, a method of action, and most importantly, a loyalty not to nations or parties, but to a deeper, older order. Many researchers have asked, why do so many key figures in global strategy councils, and from the IMF to NATO, share Jesuit educational backgrounds? Is it because they're simply brilliant, or because they were chosen? And if so, who's doing the choosing? One of the biggest mysteries revolves around unofficial meetings between religious leaders and financial power centers. According to a few insiders, these gatherings don't discuss theology or faith. They talk about things like how to keep social order during times of crisis, how to humanely control media narratives, and how to preserve public trust as governments lose credibility. And in these conversations, Jesuit scholars often play a key role. They don't command, they guide. They lead discussions with the logic of harmony, ethics, and stability. But is it really just for their intellect? There's a quieter theory, one few dare to say aloud, that the Jesuits, or the Superior General himself, are not merely guests at these gatherings. They may, in fact, be coordinating them. Not directly, but through a network of tanks, NGOs, deep research institutions, and strategically placed former insiders within global foundations. No contracts, no signatures, but everything moves with choreographed precision. Some of these meetings happen in ancient monasteries in Switzerland. Others are held at quiet universities in Austria, France, or Italy, where guests are only told the general theme, while the true facilitator remains unseen. And after each meeting, no announcements follow, but the world somehow seems to shift. Who sits in the shadows? Who remains silent while the world outside shouts? Who never speaks, and yet is heard by all? If you've ever heard the phrase, silence isn't ignorance, it's decision-making, then you may begin to understand why the Jesuits never need to stand in the spotlight to influence even the brightest places. When a story becomes too big, too deep, and too real, the most effective way to make the public stop believing it is to turn it into entertainment. It's a simple yet powerful strategy, one that modern media and the film industry have mastered for decades. And when it comes to mysterious power structures like the Jesuits, the Black Pope, or the shadowy networks behind the Vatican, Hollywood and global mainstream media have never been mere bystanders. Think back, how many times have you seen hooded monks in black robes wandering ancient monasteries, whispering Latin prayers, taking part in secret rituals, or even orchestrating assassinations, fighting over holy relics, and pulling strings behind religious power struggles? From the Da Vinci Code to Angels and Demons, from Vatican Secrets documentaries to fictional dramas hinting at a dark church, the Jesuits and Catholic secret orders have become recurring motifs in pop culture. But here's the paradox. The more they appear on screen, the more their real-life questions get dismissed as fantasy. This is known as the discredit through fiction effect, a communication technique widely noted by sociologists and psychologists. When a truth is too disturbing for the public to face, let them laugh at it or enjoy it as entertainment. And soon they'll stop looking any deeper. So who designed this strategy? And who benefits from turning religious mysteries, power conspiracies, and organizations like the Jesuits into movie plots? Here's something to think about. Many directors, screenwriters, and producers of major Vatican-themed films were educated at Jesuit universities or had academic ties to them. Schools like Georgetown, Loyola Marymount, and Boston College not only teach theology, they have top-tier media and film programs, and even fund religious film projects. It's no coincidence that many so-called anti-Vatican movies never cross the line. They may shock, but they always end with a message of peace, or bury the real core of the story under layers of supernatural fiction, romance, or wild conspiracies. And while the public debates whether the Pope is hiding the Holy Grail, or if Jesus left behind a bloodline, the real and far more serious questions get pushed into the fog of imagination. Like the power structure of the Jesuits, the role of the Superior General in global decisions, or the Vatican's financial alliances. Even in the age of the internet, where information spreads at lightning speed, topics involving the Jesuits or the Black Pope rarely break through the hidden filters. Deep, thoughtful content is pushed down the algorithm. Channels that speak too clearly get flagged, shadow banned, or quietly removed. And original historical documents are taken out of context. Stripping them of credibility has mainstream media become a perfect smokescreen. It's not to hide the truth, but to blur it, distort it, and finally make us forget. Is there a hand or a system carefully shaping the media to distract the world from asking the right questions? And if that's the case, then the screen is no longer a mirror to reality. It's a velvet curtain hiding a backstage where the true decision-makers never step into the spotlight. In every dynasty, the throne has always been the symbol of supreme power. At the Vatican, that throne is white, a sacred presence, pure and divine, symbolizing the all-encompassing authority of faith. To billions, the Pope is the head of the Catholic world, the keeper of canon law, the voice of God on earth. But how many ever stop to ask, is he truly the one in ultimate control? Behind every pope stands a tightly woven structure: cardinals, bishops, archbishops, monks, and theological scholars. But deeper still, behind closed doors, within confidential councils and off-the-record decisions, lies a force rarely named, but always present. That force is the Superior General of the Jesuits, or as many observers coldly call him, the Black Pope. Unlike the official Pope, elected by the College of Cardinals and welcomed with applause in St. Peter's Square, the Black Pope requires no public praise. He doesn't step onto balconies. He delivers no blessings. Yet his power seeps quietly into every layer of Vatican operations, from education and academic advising to media influence and global strategy. Those who have worked within the Vatican describe the Superior General as the mind behind the curtain. He doesn't pull strings in plain sight. He simply places the first stone, and then the chain reactions that follow seem to unfold naturally, as if following a script already written. Look at history. There have been popes who resigned, most notably Pope Benedict XVI, who stepped down quietly amid scandals, pressures, and unspoken forces. Who advised him? Who crafted the invisible weight that led to retreat? No one says it out loud. But in the background of that moment, the Jesuits' name quietly surfaced in countless analyses. Then came a turning point. For the first time in the Vatican's long history, a Jesuit was elected Pope, Pope Francis. A moment that seemed ordinary, but, if examined closely, marked the first time the white throne was claimed by a man from the most secretive order on earth. Was it coincidence? Or the final act in a long, silent campaign of influence? A moment when the Jesuits didn't just whisper from the wings, but stepped directly onto the stage. When the script is written by the director, it's no surprise when the lead actor begins to look a lot like him. The Superior General remains unseen, but his people, his philosophy, his carefully cultivated network now hold some of the highest posts in the Church, from young cardinals educated at Jesuit institutions to academic councils, legal advisors, and media strategists. So when the Pope reads his message from the balcony, as the world listens in 50 languages, who wrote the first draft? That question may never be publicly answered. But the more we observe how the Vatican operates, with discipline, secrecy, and near-perfect efficiency, the more we begin to realize the light of the white throne may come from somewhere far darker, deeper, and infinitely quieter. Not all power needs to be seen to exist. The most dangerous kind is the kind that never shows its face. And in the halls of the Vatican, where faith and strategy speak in ancient tongues, the one truly calling the shots is never the one in front of the camera. South America, a land of fiery spirit, where the mighty Andes stand tall against the tangled Amazon, and where the blood of ancient civilizations still lingers beneath the feet of Christ the Redeemer. But it's also a continent that throughout the 20th century was rocked again and again by military coups, dictatorships and ideological clashes between communism and capitalism. Global observers have often blamed the CIA, Mossad, or Western economic interests for meddling in the politics of countries like Argentina, Chile, Brazil, and Bolivia. But one organization rarely named, whose footprints are found everywhere, is the Jesuits. As early as the 17th century, the Jesuits had already reached the far corners of Paraguay, Peru, and Brazil, establishing reducciones, isolated religious settlements. These weren't just missionary outposts. They were experimental socio-political models where indigenous people were brought under control in the name of saving their souls. And when the empires collapsed and South American nations gained independence, the Jesuits didn't retreat. They simply shifted roles. They became advisors, educators, and at times peacemakers during political crises. But from those positions, they also shaped the minds of those who would one day take power. In the 20th century, as the US and the Soviet Union turned South America into a Cold War chessboard, many Jesuit priests openly supported liberation movements, Christian socialism, and the ideals of social equality. They became spiritual allies to resistance groups, from the Sandinistas in Nicaragua to the FARC in Colombia. But here's the paradox. The Jesuits didn't choose sides, i.e. they chose position. While some priests stood shoulder to shoulder with peasant fighters, others were lecturing at elite academies attended by the children of military leaders and top politicians. It made many wonder, were the Jesuits truly neutral, or were they strategically everywhere at once? In 1973, when President Salvador Allende, the world's first democratically elected Marxist leader, was overthrown in a bloody coup in Chile, many scholars noted religious advisors were present on both sides. Jesuit priests had stood with Allende during his campaign, yet former Jesuit students sat inside the coup command centers. Likewise, in Argentina during the Dirty War, when tens of thousands were kidnapped or disappeared, some priests were murdered for speaking out, while others remained calmly silent. And in those prisons, confessions made to Jesuit clergy were sometimes used to quietly probe for political dissidents. How could the Jesuits survive under both oppressive regimes and revolutionary uprisings? The answer lies in their enduring strategy: education, influence, and silence. They didn't carry weapons. They trained those who would. They didn't write policies. They taught the people who would. In the shadows of every coup, some prayed, some watched in silence. But the Jesuits stayed, still teaching, still writing, opening new training centers, even authoring the biographies of history's central figures, because for them, power isn't in the bullet or the ballot, it's in the mind, and ideas once planted in the right place at the right time will bloom, even under dictatorships, even in revolutions. Every dictator has a beginning. Not everyone is born with a throne beneath their feet, a rifle in their hand, or a presidential seat waiting for them. Some rise from poverty, others climb through the ranks of elite military academies. But here's the strange part. Many of them spent their formative years under the roof of Jesuit education. It may sound contradictory. How could a Catholic order built on service, humility, and education become the breeding ground for authoritarian minds? known for oppression and control? The answer lies in the Jesuit philosophy of education: discipline, logic, critical thinking, rhetoric, and the art of strategic influence. In Jesuit schools, students aren't just taught theology or classical literature, they're trained to view society as a system, one that can be understood, shaped, and controlled. Take perhaps the most famous example, Fidel Castro, the revolutionary leader of Cuba, who studied at Colegio de Belén, a prestigious Jesuit school in Havana. There he sharpened not only his intellect, but also learned the power of tight organization, how to wield words like weapons, and the profound pull of idealism. One priest who taught him once said he wasn't just smart, he knew he wanted to change the world, and Castro wasn't alone. Rafael Trujillo of the Dominican Republic, Alfredo Stroessner of Paraguay, François Duvalier of Haiti, all passed through institutions operated by the Jesuits. Strangely enough, many of them maintained quiet ties with spiritual advisors even after seizing power. The deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. Dictators aren't born monsters. They are taught how to read the crowd, how to master public psychology, how to craft symbols of power. And those tools, intentionally or not, were often sharpened in Jesuit classrooms with 500 years of tradition behind them. This doesn't mean the Jesuits create tyrants, but they do equip minds. Some use those tools to serve, others use them to rule, because every noble ideal, that once in the wrong hands, becomes vulnerable to manipulation. Imagine this. In a quiet classroom, a 14-year-old student learns to use language to persuade. Years later, that same boy stands before tens of thousands, raising a rifle, declaring a new regime. But the power he wields isn't just force, it's language, structure, and a mindset carefully forged by Jesuit hands. And in many cases, when these strongmen face internal crisis or outside threat, they return to where it all began. To the priests who once taught them, seeking spiritual counsel or quiet advice from old networks they still trust. No one can definitively say the Jesuits intended to produce dictators, but the sheer number of authoritarian leaders who once walked through their halls raises the question, were the seeds planted long ago, in silence, in discipline, and in a quiet awe of power, without anyone even noticing? World War II ended with images of Allied victory and Nazi Germany crushed into ruins. But those who truly understand history know this. Many notorious war criminals never faced trial. Adolf Eichmann, Josef Mengele, Klaus Barbie. Those names didn't die in the rubble of Berlin. They disappeared. And their disappearance wasn't a stroke of luck. It was made possible by a sophisticated escape network backed by organizations no one would suspect. Monasteries, dioceses, and most notably a secret religious corridor stretching from Europe to South America, its unofficial name, the Rat Lines. These were covert routes, often beginning in Austria, Italy, or Spain, moving through religious way stations and leading directly to Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, or Syria. The operators didn't wear uniforms, they wore robes. In declassified documents, the Vatican, particularly certain monastic branches in Italy and Austria, was suspected of helping provide fake documents, Red Cross passports, and even theological justifications for mass murderers fleeing Europe. Notably, some members of the Jesuit order were accused of offering safe haven to SS officers, Gestapo agents, and German scientists before they were quietly absorbed into larger networks like America's Operation Paperclip. Operation Paperclip, orchestrated by the CIA and its forerunners, was a mission to bring hundreds of German scientists, many of whom had served the Nazi regime, into the United States to work on military and space programs. The US didn't want these minds falling into Soviet hands. But to make them disappear from Nazi records, they needed a reliable laundering system. And the Vatican, with its ability to issue humanitarian certificates, refugee passports, and its vast monastery network across Europe, became the perfect link in the chain. Many monasteries served as temporary shelters protected by religious immunity. Some former Nazis, quietly aided by priests or monks, had their identities changed, converted on paper, and were put on ships bound for the New World. A pressing question remains: did the Jesuits, with their global network, secretive operations and deep presence in the Austria-Italy-Spain corridor, play a role? No official documents publicly confirm it, but many witnesses, researchers, and independent historians have noted this pattern. Wherever secret human flows moved, specially trained clergy were often nearby. In South America, where hundreds of former Nazi officers found paradise, they weren't welcomed by underground agents. They were welcomed by local Catholic communities, sometimes under the guidance of priests trained in Europe. Could all of this have been coincidence? One chilling theory emerges. In the eyes of some clergy, even a mass murderer could be saved if they had strategic value. If they could help fight communism or provide valuable intelligence, then helping them escape justice was quietly seen as serving a higher purpose. But here lies the core issue. Who gets to decide what purpose is higher enough? Who decided Josef Mengele deserved to vanish into safety while the millions he killed didn't even get a name? Maybe no one alive can answer that. But one thing is clear: the silence of the Vatican, and especially of powerful orders like the Jesuits, was the very reason this network survived and thrived for decades. Because once crimes can be hidden behind cathedral walls and conscience is redefined by strategy, then even the darkest killers can be blessed if they know the way. When we think of modern war zones, from the burning sands of the Middle East, the blood-soaked lands of Africa, to the fractured nations of Eastern Europe, we often picture international aid agencies, peacekeeping forces, or frontline journalists. But if you look more closely at humanitarian reports, medical logs, and relief records, one name quietly appears more often than you'd expect: the Jesuits. How did a religious order founded nearly 500 years ago to convert the heathens end up embedded in the heart of modern conflict zones? Are they saving souls, or gathering intelligence, bringing faith, or shaping post-war realities? From Iraq, Syria, Congo, to Venezuela, Afghanistan, and Myanmar, Jesuit-affiliated groups like the Jesuit Refugee Service, JRS, are always present. They set up schools in refugee camps, distribute medicine, and teach children who've lost parents to war. That image is noble, human, and true. But it's only part of the truth. Behind these humanitarian missions is an extremely disciplined network, capable of deeply embedding within local communities, understanding cultures, mastering native languages, and operating long-term without drawing attention. It's no coincidence that many intelligence agencies refer to Jesuit priests as the soft eyes and ears of the West. In war zones where information is distorted, media is censored, and governments are fragmented, Jesuit priests and brothers often become trusted sources of intelligence for many sides, not just for the Vatican, but also for embassies, NGOs, and even national intelligence services. Perhaps they don't intend to spy, but when an organization provides medical care, teaches children, interacts with orphans, elders, militia members, and defecting soldiers, the amount of localized insight they gather often surpasses that of any military unit. And when information becomes gold during wartime, those who hold it quietly steer the outcome. Take Syria, for instance, where Jesuits remained even in besieged areas like Aleppo and Homs. While most international organizations pulled out, some Jesuit groups stayed, offering medical care while observing humanitarian conditions. And soon, their reports, funneled through the Vatican, found their way onto the desks of European leaders. In the Congo, one of the world's worst humanitarian disasters, Jesuits did more than open schools. They engaged in reconciliation dialogues between warring factions. Once again, they acted as mediators, but mediators with their own philosophy, curriculum, and at times their own political orientation, guiding the youth they educated. As the world undergoes a new phase of geopolitical realignment, with a growing backlash against military intervention, soft forces like the Jesuits are becoming more vital than ever. They carry no weapons, yet wield enormous influence over the social and ideological aftermath of conflict, which leads us to a difficult question. Are they simply driven by Christian ideals, or are they spiritual engineers quietly rebuilding nations from the ashes? Perhaps the answer lies in the Jesuits' original 16th century strategy to infiltrate through education, dominate through ideology, and transform without force. In an era where bombs no longer win wars, figures like them, dressed in black robes, smiling gently, and armed with strategic minds, may well be the new power in postmodern warfare. In a world spiraling through technology, a new kind of Cold War, and a deepening crisis of trust, few notice that the Jesuits are still here, not loud, not flashy, but never gone. And at the center of this vast, quiet network stands one man, quietly overseeing nearly 16,000 Jesuits across 112 countries. He's not on TV. He doesn't post on social media. And outside of inner circles, few truly know what he thinks. His name is Arturo Sosa Abascal, a Venezuelan priest born in Caracas in 1948, holding a doctorate in political science. He once taught at Georgetown University, served as the rector of a Catholic university and, most notably, was elected in 2016 as the 31st Superior General of the Society of Jesus. In this role, he is the direct successor to Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits in the 16th century. They call him the Black Pope, not because of his skin color, but because of the power he holds, power that moves in the shadows, a power not codified in papal decrees, but in authority to deploy, to direct, to shape, and sometimes to intervene. What makes Arturo Sosa exceptional is not just his academic background, it's his nuanced, almost elusive political philosophy. While most religious leaders steer clear of geopolitics, he speaks openly on capitalism, social injustice, climate change, migration, and the complex relationship between faith and power. Many analysts believe he's not just a spiritual leader. He's an architect behind the scenes, quietly rebuilding the Vatican's role in the emerging global order. A priest fluent in theology, well-versed in Marxist philosophy, and a former participant in international research councils on politics, economics, and sustainable development. Fluent in Spanish, Italian, English, and conversant in French, he doesn't need to speak often. A few closed-door meetings, a few internal memos, and strategic youth education through Jesuit universities worldwide, that's enough to shift social influence. Picture this: CEOs, scholars, and politicians across the Americas, Europe, and Asia, but many of them were once students in Jesuit institutions. They were shaped by a philosophy of spiritual discernment, but also trained in service, leadership, and social strategy through the Jesuit curriculum. So ask yourself, who truly shapes the future, if not those who taught them how? To think from the very beginning, and that is the power of a Black Pope. He doesn't need to be in the spotlight. He only needs to keep the system alive, quietly, effectively, constantly reproducing global influence through education, humanitarian work, philosophy, and politics. You may have never heard him speak. You may have never seen his face in the media. But if you've noticed shifts in global education and how we define justice in the way young leaders are being formed, then believe this: behind those changes, there is a man in a black robe redrawing the world's map, with intellect and unshakable loyalty to the Society of Jesus. And so the 21st century, no matter how technological, how AI-driven, how globalized, still cannot erase the reach of an organization that's stayed hidden for nearly 500 years. And the one leading it today is none other than Arturo Sosa, the Black Pope of our time. As the world entered the 21st century, many believed the era of political religion had come to an end. The Crusades, popes with military power, bloody holy wars, all seemed like relics of a distant past. In the modern view, religion was expected to step aside, to make room for science, democracy, and the free market. But history rarely moves in straight lines, and in the shadows of global crises, climate change, proxy wars, mass migration, poverty, and social injustice, religion is quietly returning, not as pure faith, but as a refined form of political power. The Vatican, with its uninterrupted 2,000-year vision, seemed to sense this return before anyone else. And within the Vatican, the Jesuits, with their gift for strategic discernment and social maneuvering, have become the active arm of this comeback, not with guns, not with laws, but through ideological influence, through education, through weaving religious philosophy into public policy. This new face of religious power became clearest in Latin America, where Jesuit priests are no longer just preaching sermons, but actively engaging in land reform, advocating for indigenous rights, and even dialoguing with leftist movements. Religion is no longer standing outside politics. It's back as an old player wearing a new face, intellectual, humanitarian, and strategic. In Africa, Jesuit-founded schools are shaping a new generation of leaders trained to become responsible global citizens. A beautiful phrase, yet beneath it lies a deeply Catholic sociological lens, one that shapes how these future leaders view the world, power, and justice. In Asia, especially the Philippines, South Korea, and even Vietnam, humanitarian organizations and social media platforms rooted in Jesuit networks are quietly steering political discourse. They don't spread propaganda, but they do shape values. And even in the West, today, where Catholicism was once seen as outdated, religion is being rediscovered, not for its rituals, but for the spiritual grounding it offers in a fractured, postmodern world. Young people are returning to churches, not out of nostalgia, but because they seek something solid in an age of moral relativism and identity crises. Today's political religion no longer resembles the medieval model. There are no popes wearing crowns. It's subtler and perhaps more dangerous because it doesn't need to seize power. It only needs to influence those who already have it. And in that game, the Jesuits once again stand at the crossroads of ideals and authority. With a global network, timeless intellect, and the ability to permeate every level of society, they don't need flags or armies. They only need young minds who believe they're changing the world for the better without realizing who defines what better means. Political religion hasn't returned through grand gates. It's slipped back in quietly, through classrooms, conferences, social platforms, climate policy, global forums, and humanitarian foundations. And like an invisible wind, it circles back to the center of the Vatican, where a white pope preaches climate justice, and a black pope silently sketches the spiritual roadmap for the world to come. We grew up with textbooks. Each page was a lesson, a timeline, a noble figure, curated, reviewed, and stamped by official boards of approval. But for that very reason, what isn't in the textbook often matters more, because real history, the deeper, darker, and sometimes more dangerous kind, rarely fits within what's permitted to be taught. And if there's one name that appears only faintly, if at all, in those textbooks, it's this: the Jesuits. Despite holding a central role in education, politics, and religion for nearly 500 years, the Jesuits are rarely explored in any meaningful depth in public school curricula. Why? Perhaps because their influence is too complex, or perhaps because their quiet power doesn't fit in a 45-minute lesson. But the real reason might be simpler. They don't want students asking too many questions. No one points out that many of history's most powerful dictators were Jesuit-educated. No textbook explains that global tycoons frequently fund Jesuit institutions. No curriculum reveals that global meetings on finance, tech, and religion still quietly involve Jesuit observers or advisors. Textbooks don't mention that during the colonial era, the Jesuits acted as bridges between European courts and native civilizations, working not just through faith, but through intelligence, maps, and, at times, strategic negotiations. They didn't just preach, they reported, they analyzed, and they remembered. No one tells you that many conspiracy theories swirling around the Vatican, as involving banks, post-war migration networks, media control, often feature at least one figure with a Jesuit education. They don't need to hold high office, they just need to be in the room at the right moment. We study world wars in school, but rarely hear about the role of Jesuit priests in resistance movements, or in post-war reconstruction, or in protecting secret escape networks tied to Nazi Germany, the ones people now call Operation Paperclip or the Ratlites. Mainstream history praises scientific progress as a triumph of modern reason. But it forgets to mention that many of the world's most influential thinkers, physicists, and philosophers, from Descartes to Teilhard de Chardin, were shaped by Jesuit thought, which means they didn't just think scientifically, they thought within a deeper metaphysical framework, one today's students are never taught to recognize. The truth is, these ideas can be taught, but once they are, students might start asking who writes the textbooks, who decides which chapters are included, who approves which knowledge becomes official, and which truths are silenced. And those are the very questions systems do not want students to ask. We're taught to remember Galileo as a symbol of science versus the church, but few are told that Jesuit scholars were the ones who initially protected him, that the priests in the Vatican observatories weren't the ignorant men we often imagine, and that the clash between religion and science was far more complicated than we were led to believe. Because as one old Jesuit manuscript once put it, knowledge without direction can become a double-edged sword, but when properly guided, it becomes the greatest tool for shaping the world. And so, it's what's not in the textbook. That's often the most important thing to read. From the Middle Ages to the modern era, religion has always worn two faces, one sacred, turned toward God, and one secular, turned toward power. And when an institution represents both faith and control of information, wealth, people, and strategy, one must ask, where is the line between belief and power, and who is watching that line? For the Jesuits, a group expelled from more than 80 countries, yet still surviving, growing, and embedding itself deeper within global power structures, that question becomes sharper. They preach humility, yet operate like a superpower. They pray daily, yet oversee dozens of universities, hundreds of research centers, and an unofficial intelligence network spanning 4 continents. We're taught to think of religion as a refuge for the soul. But when religion controls human data, shapes minds, influences policy, and commands multidisciplinary knowledge, It no longer merely saves, it shapes history, and that's where the line begins to blur. When a superior general can influence universities around the world, from Georgetown in the US to Sophia in Japan to Camilla's in Spain, and those institutions produce future presidents, ministers, and CEOs. Is that mission work or strategy? When Jesuit priests sit on advisory boards at the United Nations on humanitarian issues, climate change, education, and environmental policy, are they serving God or are they becoming the moral directors of the planet? And when the Jesuits don't hold public office but still advise the Vatican, world governments, and even transnational financial corporations, what power is really shaping the world? Few know this. The traditional Jesuit oath includes a vow of absolute obedience to the Pope, even in unclear matters. And yet, paradoxically, no religious order has clashed more with the Vatican than the Jesuits. They were dissolved in 1773, only to be restored in 1814, and each time they returned, they came back stronger. This raises a deeper question. Can faith remain pure when it becomes a tool to sustain influence? And can power remain sacred when it relies on silent, unchecked networks? The Jesuits are not demons, but they are not mere angels either. They are a global order built on belief, trained through intellect, and run like a sophisticated strategic machine. And in an age where power is scattered across technology, religion, finance, AI, and emerging ideologies, the Jesuits sit at the crossroads of them all. The question is no longer, do they have power? It's, who controls that power? And more importantly, can anyone? When an organization bears both the cross and the compass of influence, the line between faith and dominion is no longer a straight path, but a labyrinth. And inside that labyrinth, much of the world walks forward, unaware of who's leading them. Every empire has its king, every religion has its high priest, every system has its architect. But in today's world, where religion, finance, technology, and academia melt together into a new form of power, one final question becomes more terrifying than ever. Who truly rules? We see presidents, CEOs, and religious leaders on the screen. But are they really at the center of power? Or are they just the faces and the frontmen of something deeper, older, and far more silent? Deep within the Vatican, there are doors not meant for the public. High atop the academic world, there are theories never spoken aloud. And in the heart of the modern age, where data, belief, and dreams are manipulated daily, a quiet question keeps echoing. Do we really know who decides? In tracing the story of the Jesuits, from harsh oaths and hidden influence to exile, resurgence, and a vast network of education and politics, one truth has become clear. They never disappeared. They adapted. They hid in plain sight. And sometimes they stood at the very center of it all, without ever signing their names. They've been called God's soldiers. But perhaps they are the quiet architects of a world no one dares to name. Not with war, not with violence, but with thought, structure, and the power to convince an entire generation of leaders that they are fighting for justice without ever asking who defines that justice. The Black Pope, an unofficial title, absent from any religious constitution, yet spoken with hushed reverence. No one elects him in a democratic vote. Yet his influence reaches beyond that of many heads of state. When a man needs no public presence, no campaign, no social media, and still shapes the direction of global education, media ethics, and humanitarian policy, then perhaps he holds true power. You may live your entire life never hearing his name, but if you've studied in a Jesuit school, been shaped by Catholic social teaching, or believed in a vision of a just and ideal world, then perhaps You've already heard his whisper. Not a voice that declares, "I rule," but one that gently asks, "Are you sure you're the one choosing?" In a world full of data but starved of truth, full of faith but lacking guides, the answer no longer matters. Only the question remains. Quiet, persistent, never printed in a textbook. Who truly rules the world we live in? And more haunting still, when did our faith become their tool? This is the end of our journey into the mysteries surrounding the Jesuits, the Vatican, and the invisible throne in the shadows, a place with no crown, yet with the power to rewrite history without spilling a single drop of blood. If you found this journey thought-provoking, and you want to keep exploring the hidden layers of history, the untold mysteries, the stories that were never meant to be heard, then don't forget to subscribe to Bedtime History, a small action. But it's the key to unlocking deeper, farther, and sometimes more dangerous stories.